Sean Diddy Combs was convicted on 2 federal charges, each carrying up to 10 years in prison. But now, in a twist maybe no one saw coming, reports say President Donald Trump's team has been in talks with Diddy's lawyers about a possible presidential pardon. Could Trump really set Diddy free? Is this justice, politics, maybe payback?
The courtroom was a pressure cooker long before the judge ever entered. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, a sea of eyes locked forward, some leaning forward so far their knuckles whitened against the wooden benches. The air was thick, not just from the anticipation but from the weight of years of whispers.
Full criminal trial, 7 weeks of testimony and a verdict that ended in Sean Diddy Combs' conviction on 2 federal sex crimes charges. Could he be pardoned by the President of the United States? You know, that is a question that came up a lot when we were doing the live streams of the Diddy trial every day on YouTube. I never really considered it as a real possibility, but I'll tell you what, now, based on current reporting, we may have to take this seriously. Oh, and in terms of relief for Diddy, we also have to get into his defense team's new memo that they filed arguing that his conviction should be thrown out, or at the very least, he should get a new trial. We're going to talk about that too. And by the way, let me tell you, we have an amazing guest who I'm going to be bringing on in a little bit, somebody who actually helped secure federal pardons for his clients, including from President Trump, and is an expert in criminal law, has been following this case from the very beginning. I'm going to bring him on in a little bit. But why do I say that we have to take pardons seriously now? Why? Well, TMZ has reported that President Donald Trump's administration has been talking to Diddy's legal team about a potential pardon, a forgiveness for a federal crime. It's enshrined in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, the president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. And according to TMZ, his decision to pardon Diddy may be determined based on if Judge Arun Subramanian grants Diddy bail, which, by the way, we dedicated a whole sidebar to the other day. His team just filed a brand new letter with the court asking for him to be released. I broke it down, discussed all those arguments. But TMZ also has reported that the pardon decision could also come down to how Diddy is ultimately sentenced on October 3rd. And remember, he was acquitted of racketeering and sex trafficking, but he was found guilty of the 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution, the Mann Act violations, namely transporting his exes, Jane and Cassie Ventura Fine, and men across state lines for the purposes of sex work. Each charge carries up to 10 years in prison, although I'll tell you in a prior filing, the government was looking at roughly 4 to 5 year prison sentence. Oh, President Trump was asked about this a few months ago before the verdict. This was back in May. And he said when asked about a pardon for Diddy, I would certainly look at the facts. If I think somebody was mistreated, whether they like me or don't like me, it wouldn't have any impact on me. He used to really like me a lot, but I think when I ran for politics, that relationship busted up from what I read. I don't know, he didn't tell me that, but I'd read some little bit nasty statements in the paper all of a sudden. And Diddy had been photographed with Trump over the years. There was some sort of relationship there. President Trump even called him a good friend on a 2012 episode of his TV show The Apprentice. The problem is, some comments Diddy made about Trump in recent years as Diddy really entered the political realm. There's a video where he's speaking to radio host Charlemagne saying, if Trump gets elected, I really do believe in my heart there'll be a race war. In another video on Revolt, he says white men like Trump need to be banished. And by the way, you know who's not letting anyone forget this? Combs' rival 50 Cent. Took to social media recently, wrote, see, Trump don't like S like this, buddy. You run your mouth too much.
Rumors and scandals that had finally crystallized into this single, unavoidable moment. In the front, Diddy sat at the defense table, a man who had once walked into any room with the kind of energy that made people shift to accommodate him now looked like he was carved from stone. He wore a tailored suit, immaculate as always, but there was a stiffness to it, like armor he hoped could hide the tremor running beneath. His fingers were interlaced on the table before him, knuckles pressing tight enough to blanch the skin. His jaw was locked, the muscles twitching every so often as if restraining words he dared not speak. His legal team flanked him, seasoned, sharp, expensive, but even they carried a certain stillness today, the kind of calm that wasn't confidence but resignation. Their eyes were fixed forward, their expressions unreadable, their postures rigid. They had
that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3, general issues about
prepared for this, yes, but there was an unspoken truth lingering among them. Preparation is not the same as power, and in this room, only one person held the power to decide his fate. When the door behind the bench opened, the sound was impossibly loud. The shuffle of robes against the floor seemed to echo, every step pulling the moment closer. The judge emerged, eyes forward, expression void of warmth or malice, just the steady, unyielding face of the law. Taking their seat, the judge adjusted the microphone, opened the thick case file, and began to read. It started with the basics, the formalities, the procedural acknowledgments, but then the tone shifted. The judge's voice, calm but resolute, began to outline the charges in detail. Each one hit the air like a hammer, sharp and deliberate. The gallery was silent except for the occasional shuffle of paper or the scratch of a journalist's pen. The list was long, longer than many expected. Dates, places, incidents, evidence gathered over months, even years, witness testimonies, corroborated accounts, recordings, and documents.
Well, given that the top of our show, Jesse, or the top of your show, because it's a sidebar presented by Law and Crime with the host of Jesse Weber, but given at the top of the show that we didn't announce that Sean Combs walked out of this courthouse, I think it was kind of a little bit of a spoiler for the viewers here that the judge decided to keep him behind bars until his sentencing hearing. So I did see kind of a little bit of disappointment from both Sean Combs and his family after the judge made his decision. So the judge said that the jury convicted the defendant on count 3 and 5. despite that being the Mann Act. He says bail is denied because the government correctly noted that detention is mandatory and it's not appropriate for Sean Combs to be released on bail given the charges that he's still been convicted of. And so the judge says that they disagree with the defense's argument, saying that any felony under 117, and Jesse, you probably know that more than me, requires detention. And he said even if the defendant is required to not be likely to present a danger to the community, the judge even kind of pointing out just some of what we had heard during the trial, where the defense conceded that the defendant, Sean Combs, was violent. The judge said, "We own the domestic violence." And that was a word that he took from the transcript because Mark Agnifilo had said that in open court. He told the jurors that, and he told them that multiple times. And the judge pointed it out multiple times from the transcript. He says that the defendant's concession as to domestic violence wasn't necessary. He pointed out Mark Agnifilo's closing, where he says it's horrible for Miss Ventura what she had gone through, and that domestic violence is the issue, kind of even pointing to her Instagram statement that she had made after the 2016 video was released on CNN. And again, the judge was saying that the video is very much domestic violence, even kind of pointing to the London hotel incident, saying where Mark Agnifilo had pointed out that obviously something happened, that he was violent at times, and that conceding the defendant's violence, that he even poses no danger, that he was pointing to violence happened after the HSI raids in March of 2024, because they kind of pointed to what had happened to Jane just a couple months after, and pointing back to the June 2024 incident, which was just a little more than a year ago to this day. And so for those reasons, and just some more reasons too, the judge decided that the defendant will remain behind bars pending his sentencing.
And yeah, I looked at the government's letter, and they were like, they talked about violence, they talked about drug use, they talked about the abuse of Cassie, that you have multiple victims in this case, that he used the staff to carry out these transportation to engage in prostitution crimes, that he tried to obstruct justice with respect to these crimes, that under the Bail Reformed Act, they argued this was a crime of violence, that he poses a serious risk of flight, a danger to the community. So clearly it seems that the judge was persuaded by that. The judge did mention something really, really interesting, because somebody would listen to this and say, oh my gosh, he's going to throw the book at him. He actually said the court takes no position on what it will consider at sentencing, nor what sentence it will impose. However, we kind of got a little bit of a preview of what a potential sentence could be, right? We kind of got an idea of what the defense is advocating and what the government is advocating.
The judge did not raise their voice, yet each word seemed to cut through the air like glass. Diddy's eyes never left the bench, but there was a flicker, a flash of something raw, when certain names and events were spoken aloud. They weren't just accusations anymore. They were part of the public record, immortalized in the court's language. This wasn't the controlled environment of a PR statement or an interview. There was no spinning these facts. The murmurs began in the back rows when the judge described incidents that had been rumored for years but never confirmed. The kind of whispered stories that floated through the industry late at night but were always dismissed as gossip. Now, under oath and in front of the world, they were no longer whispers. Then came the financial records, transfers between shell companies, cash withdrawals in the hundreds of thousands, sudden appearances of luxury assets under unfamiliar names. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded like business as usual for a mogul, but to the court, with the evidence laid bare, it told a different story, one of concealment, one of calculated movement, one of intent. The judge paused only once, flipping to another section of the file.
Lawsuit since 2023, November of that year. And I just remember thinking that there would be some type of reckoning within the hip hop community, the Black community, as far as Me Too goes, something kind of similar. And I thought possibly, and I think maybe other people thought so too, that maybe Sean Combs was kind of that person that would, bring about this kind of reckoning in the hip hop community as far as Me Too goes. But do you think that can still happen? Do you think that will still happen?
Well, I think that Diddy's trial, served as a clarion call, a wake-up call, canary in the mine, so to speak, as it relates to you could be as powerful, as popular, as wealthy as Diddy. I mean, keep in mind, he called himself Brother Love. He got the key to New York City in the months or the year leading up to all of this, right?
Yeah.
And he was sitting on what some might say is the highest pedestal. And look how far he has fallen. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time, you have that going on. And so people can look, if you really look at the case, and not just the legal case, but the case in the court of public opinion. And victims, if you will, won because he has not only did he have a criminal case he had to deal with, but he has what, upwards of 20, 30 civil cases
I think
that
even
he's
more than
also going to have
that.
to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And each one of those cases, even if it's not proved by the victim that it happened, he is still going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees for each and every single case, and maybe millions for the more serious and those that get further down the line. So he's not done paying for his transgressions. And I think that for other people who are in similarly situated positions of power and influence, they certainly took notes from the Diddy trial and figured out, hey, if I continue to act like a pig,
Yeah.
pigs get slaughtered.
Yes, they do. And I just remember even in the outcome of the Sean Combs lawsuits that were filed, even probably before he was indicted, we were hearing and seeing more civil suits filed against other people. And even after this
Yes.
case, we've seen more high-profile figures have complaints against them, like Tyler Perry and Shannon Sharp and Smokey Robinson, all of which have denied the allegations against them. But I do think that a lot more people are willing to come forward, even if they're anonymous or even if they're willing to put their name out there too. But I'm curious, Adante, if you had a crystal ball, what are you expecting out of Diddy's October sentencing? Do you think it'll be kind of in the high max range or possibly on the lower end? I believe federal prosecutors are only asking for 4 years. The defense wants half of that, 2 years, possibly with a year of time served. So he could possibly be out next year around this time. But what are you expecting out of the sentencing?
Yeah, I don't see the judge giving him 4 or 5 years. If the prosecution asks for that time. So now that's kind of like the judge to go beyond that would have to find something that was aggravating in his mind to say, look, I'm going to give you more time than what the prosecution is even asking for. That doesn't happen, but it does happen at times. And it's pretty rare, but it's certainly something that's on the table. I just don't see that happening here. Instead, the judge could come down with a sentence, 2 years, 3 years. Diddy, by the time he shows up in court for sentencing, will have a year and a month in custody.
Mm-hmm.
So he's going to get credit for that time. The judge should give him 3 years.
The room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the air understood the weight of what was coming next. It was time for the sentencing. The words landed like a series of detonations. The length of the sentence was far beyond what even the harshest commentators had predicted. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't meant as a slap on the wrist. It was definitive, life-altering, career-ending. The gallery reacted instantly, audible gasps, sharp intakes of breath, a few scattered exclamations before the bailiff's stern glance silenced them again. Diddy sat frozen. It was a stillness so complete it almost looked like disbelief, but the tremor in his hands gave him away. His lips moved slightly, perhaps mouthing the words to himself, as if repeating them would make them sound less real. They didn't. He leaned toward his lead attorney, voice low but urgent, the movement sharp, almost frantic, the lawyer's head tilted, eyes heavy with the kind of truth no client ever wants to hear. A slow shake. There was no maneuver left, no immediate lifeline to grab onto. The judge's entrance cut through the air like a blade, robes flowing, expression unreadable. The judge took their seat, looked over the file, and without hesitation began to read.
FBI, police, even some CIA. So again, my people would not risk their lives on something or risk their reputation or even possibly a criminal charge on something like this. So my guys are vetted. They've been doing this a very long time. So they wouldn't jeopardize anything like that. Now, when we first talked about private security, Puffy wanted some of his people. We denied that right away. It's our guys. It's my reputation on the line here. And that's when I went to court and Tony Rico and Mark Agnifilo both stood up and said, hey, Mr. Judelson is, his reputation's on the line here. He's been doing this a long time. I've bailed out Harvey Weinstein, Conor McGregor, Plaxico Burress, Cat Williams, Lawrence Taylor. So, I'm not going to put my reputation or my license in jeopardy, for X amount of money. To me, I'm going on. I might want to turn this business over to my son one day.
Yeah, the New York Times did a profile on you called Bailing Out the Stars. How are celebrities different? How are they different from other criminal defendants?
More demanding. When you get the phone call from the lawyer or whoever, a publicist, anybody. It could happen in the middle of the night. A celebrity does not want to spend an extra minute incarcerated. And, things change so drastically with, when I did Conor McGregor, he surrendered, he wanted out right away. Plaxico Burress, when that happened, we were talking, and Mayor Bloomberg was involved allegedly in the situation, and Plaxico's bail went from X to X to X. And then I'm on the phone with his agent saying, hey, I need you to send me a copy of his deed for his place in New Jersey. And then with Dominic Strauss-Kahn, obviously, the world basically came to a standstill because he was the IMF, president, and nobody knew if he was on his way going back to Greece to lend him X amount of money, get him out of trouble. Yet we had to find him an apartment in the city. We had to get him private security. I was dealing with his ex-wife now, coming in and giving me what I need to put a $5 million bail together. So, they're a little more demanding, and everybody's looking to me to make that, make it happen. The lawyer could get the bail, but at the end of the day, it's Ira Jellison that's running in, putting everything together, and the pressure. And I work in chaos all day long. That's my life. So, when it comes to chaos, that's my specialty.
You handle it well, though. You handle it quite well, given the chaos.
I have to. If I, as I said before, if I want to, have a nice home, I want my kids to go to college, I want things to happen. You got to do these things, and people rely on you.
Absolutely, and I think there's something to be said here, and it's important that you said it. Your reputation's on the line. So the idea of when we say, nebulous, how can we trust a private security team? I'm happy you clarified that. I want to get really practical here, realistically. Sean Combs is released on bail. Okay, let's say he's released. He's home confinement. What exactly is he allowed to do?
The words came slowly at first, deliberate, almost surgical. The charges were laid out. The evidence recounted, the testimonies repeated. Each sentence was a nail in the coffin, each fact another reminder that the walls had closed in. Diddy shifted in his seat. His face remained composed, but his eyes told a different story. There was anger, there was disbelief, and there was the faint glimmer of desperation. Around him, his legal team stared straight ahead, their expressions carefully blank. They had prepared for this moment, but preparation could not soften the blow of what was coming. And then it happened. The judge's voice grew firmer, heavier. The decision was about to be revealed. The room seemed to tighten, the air grow colder. When the sentence was finally read aloud, it was as if the entire courtroom inhaled at once. Gasps echoed off the walls. Some clutched their mouths. Others glanced around in shock, unable to believe what they had just heard. Diddy froze, his head tilted slightly, as if trying to process the words. His lips parted, but no sound came out. For a man who had built an empire
of what sentencing could be like. Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take each step at a time and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission. And he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act convictions should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. There were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that goes, I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main
confidence, charisma, and control. This was a moment of complete and utter powerlessness. His world, his future, his freedom, gone in a single declaration from the bench. The sentence was longer than anyone had anticipated, harsher than even the most pessimistic predictions. It wasn't just about punishment. It was a statement, a message to the industry, to the public, to anyone watching: no one is above the law. Diddy's hands trembled slightly. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering something urgent, but the lawyer's only response was a slow shake of the head. There would be no immediate escape from this. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Journalists scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture every detail. Cameras clicked from the back of the room. Outside, news crews were already preparing the headlines that would dominate the evening broadcasts. For Diddy, this was more than a legal defeat, it was a public unmasking. Years of influence, power, and privilege could not shield him from this moment. The judge's words still hung in the air, unshakable, final. The cameras at the back of the room clicked in a flurry. Every frame captured a different angle of the same reality, the fall of one of music's most powerful figures. The judge's voice did not waver as they finished the ruling, instructing the court officers to prepare for custody transfer. It was done, final, unchangeable in this moment. And then, it broke. The composure that had clung to Diddy all morning shattered in an instant. He spoke, louder now, voice cracking under the strain. It wasn't eloquence, it was raw, unfiltered emotion, frustration, disbelief, anger, all tangled together and spilling out. He gestured sharply, his words aimed first at his lawyers, then toward the bench, then to no one in particular, as though trying to claw back control of the narrative.
Their verdict. Why I say that is because if you think a person who's battered, someone who's been a victim, someone who's been assaulted in the ways that were described, most people have an idea as to how they will respond and act towards that, or their expectation if it happened to their loved one, how they'd expect their loved one to act. And in those situations, you don't expect someone to be tweeting, you don't expect somebody to be sending texts telling their abuser that they love them or that they want more of what took place. However, there are other people who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what? That's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits, and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's
But there was no control left to claim. The bailiff stepped forward, calm, firm, unyielding. The murmurs swelled again as the reality of what they were seeing settled into the bones of the room. The gavel came down, 3 sharp cracks against the wood. Session adjourned. Outside, the courthouse steps were already flooded with press, microphones, cameras, live feeds streaming to millions around the world. Headlines were being typed in real time, social media exploding with speculation, condemnation, and disbelief. But inside, in that heavy, echoing courtroom, the man who had once been untouchable was being led away, not as a mogul, not as a legend, but as a prisoner. And for the first time in decades, Diddy wasn't the one controlling the beat. The beat was now the sound of chains, the rhythm dictated by the law,